Hey everyone, in today's video we are talking about one of the most important things to help students build their reading comprehension and language comprehension, and that is vocabulary. Now, over the last couple years, I have shared two different vocabulary videos where I share some research-based activities for teaching students to develop not only their breadth of vocabulary knowledge, so how many words they know, but also their depth of that vocabulary knowledge, so how well they know a word. Those two videos look like this right here, and those activities are still great and wonderful. I'm going to link both those videos in the description down below in case you want to check them out after this video. But today I want to answer some questions that teachers have asked me over the years about vocabulary. Some of the questions I've received over the years include, how do we know how many words to teach our students? Where do we get our words that we teach our students? And how exactly do we teach them all? So in today's video, I'm going to address all those questions as well as walk you through the explicit steps to teaching students vocabulary words effectively. Before I dive in, I would love to know from you two different things. Number one, how do you choose your vocabulary words that you teach your students? And number two, how many words do you think you explicitly teach per week? Let me know down in the comments, and if you can add your grade level, that always helps. All right, if you're ready to dive in, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. Alright, so since we know that having a developed vocabulary really helps students with their language and reading comprehension, they go hand in hand, I do want to share some of the other activities that I've shared in my previous videos because again, they are research-based and they are great to use with your students. So I'm just going to list them right here. You will probably recognize a few of them, and if you have questions about them, check out my other videos so you can see. So some great research-based activities include using word gradients, where students kind of spread out different variation or shades of a word. Really diving into words with multiple meanings. I have a multiple meaning triangle activity that I love. Choosing our words purposefully in the classroom and really picking some high value words to integrate into our language. Teaching students connections and categories of words, providing students with yes or no examples of a word, and also encouraging students to use these words on their own. So again, all those activities are still great ones to use with your students. Feel free to go back and take a little screenshot of those right there in case you need some more activities to use with your students to develop their vocabulary. All right, so if you have done some research on vocabulary and how to develop our students' vocabulary, you've probably heard the terms word rich versus word poor. And what that means is we're talking about the amount of words our students know, so their breadth of vocabulary, when they come into a classroom. If a student is word rich, that means they have a pretty expansive vocabulary for their age, and they probably really understand quite a few words. So not only, again, do they have a good breadth of vocabulary, but they also have a good depth of vocabulary. If a student is word poor, it means that they don't know as many vocabulary words, or they are kind of, lower on the scale of knowing as many vocabulary words as their peers. And that can happen for many, many different reasons outside of school. Again, this is what students come into the classroom already knowing. So as teachers, especially in the K-2 world where these students are new to our classrooms, we want to make sure that we are trying to close the gap between the word rich and the word poor. And while we know that our students are able to pick up words in context just by hearing them, listening to them be read, sometimes watching them on TV, we know that happens, but we actually need to be more mindful to make sure that we're choosing high value words in our classroom. So this kind of goes back to the tip I shared earlier about choosing our words purposefully, especially if we happen to be in a classroom that we are teaching where we have a lot of students who would be word poor and maybe don't know as many vocabulary words as the average, 6-year-old or 7-year-old, etc. We want to be extra careful then to choose high value words when we are speaking to our students. So not only do we need to be purposeful in choosing our words and making sure we are, sharing these high value words and giving synonyms and making connections so students know what they mean just in our daily language, but we also need to explicitly teach vocabulary words. And that is what this video is going to be about. So let's get to our first question, which is, how many vocabulary words should we teach each week? Now, research on this shows that students actually learn over 1,000 words per year, but obviously there is not enough time in the day for us to explicitly teach all these different words. We wouldn't be doing anything else. That is why students obviously gather these words. They learn these new words from other places, like us choosing such high value words and just using them in conversations with their peers, different media that they watch or listen to. Students are gathering that information. They are learning new words at a rapid pace. But that being said, we as teachers need to explicitly teach our students 10 to 12 words per week. If we teach our students 10 to 12 words per week with 180 days in the year, we roughly get to teach our students 400 new words every single school year. And again, this is explicit vocabulary learning, so not only are they making connections with these words and adding them to their vocabulary, but they're learning them at a deeper level. We want our students to be able to own these words. I'll be interested to read your comments that I asked at the beginning of this video on how many words you think you explicitly teach per week to your students, and see if that kind of aligns with the 10 to 12 that research shows. Okay, so now that we know we need to teach 10 to 12 vocabulary words explicitly each week, the next question I often get is, where do we choose our words from, right? I have had so many teachers ask me over the past if there's like specific vocabulary lists that are great for K through 2, and while that would be wonderful, and there are a few that are out there, they're not the best for your classroom. They're not that reliable, and that's for two different reasons. Number one, every classroom is going to be different. And again, we talked about word rich versus word poor, and it'll depend on what your students already know. And it's really hard to actually assess exactly how many vocabulary words students know. So that is a little difficult to just choose from a list. You might be wasting your time doing so. And secondly, research has shown that teaching new vocabulary words is actually much better when it's integrated in the other learning your students are doing. So instead of just choosing words from a list, there are a few better ways to choose the words you're going to teach to your students. The easiest and most obvious way to choose vocabulary words is going to be through your read alouds. We know that when we are giving a read aloud to our students during our literacy block each day, we are choosing great books. We're talking about theme, we're talking about main idea, we're practicing all sorts of skills, but the books we choose should also have, again, high value vocabulary within them for our students to learn. Now, when choosing words from any book, there's a few things you want to keep in mind to help you choose the best words from a story. Number one, you want to choose words that are central to the theme of the story, right? Words that your students really need to understand to actually understand what's happening in the story. So if there's a big word in here that is central to the main idea, that is definitely a word you will want to teach to your kids. Another thing to keep in mind is some words that are great for teaching explicitly are words with multiple meanings. I shared earlier at the beginning of this video my multiple meanings triangle activity, where we'll pick a word like bark, for example, and we will talk about all the different ways the word bark is used and the different meanings, and we'll match them up. But if there is a word in a story that is a word like bark or deck or frame, words like that where your students may have one idea of what it means and then they hear it in the context of a story and they're like, that doesn't align. Words with multiple meanings are great ones to teach to your students explicitly. And lastly, when choosing words from a read aloud, you really want to stick to those tier 2 words. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard about tiered vocabulary, but let me just go over it real quick and give a little refresher for anyone that might not know. Here's the pyramid symbol for the 3 tiers of vocabulary instruction, and essentially this is how we can group all of the vocabulary words that we have in our English language. So first we have tier 1 words down on the bottom. These are basic, common vocabulary that many children learn early, like words like sad, happy, hot, laugh. These words are usually known by students with any sort of normal language development and are not ones that need to be explicitly taught. It is important if you do have a classroom filled with high-risk learners or English language learners that you make sure they know some of the tier 1 words. There may be one or two that they maybe have not heard, especially if they are central to the story, and you can just simply quickly teach them what that word means. Now I'm going to skip over tier 2 for a second. I'll get to that last. At the top of the pyramid, we have our tier 3 words, and these words only need a brief definition in context before moving on. And that's because they are very infrequently occurring words. They're not words that your students will hear often all the time. A lot of times they are content specific, like for science or for mathematics. Thinking about words like reins, if we're talking about reins on a horse. These are words that when they come up in a story, you will simply take a nice quick pause, tell your students what that word means, and continue reading. Your students won't really need to dive into it. You may want to show a quick picture so they understand, and then we kind of move on. And then here in the middle, we have our tier 2 words. Now, these are the words that you want to pick and teach explicitly. That's because these are more high frequency words, but they're a little bit more sophisticated and abstract than our tier 1 words. So instead of words like happy, sad, that people use all the time, we might have words like avoid, fortunate, sly. These are words that your students will likely hear across many different contexts and experiences as they continue to grow up. So these are the ones that we should really focus on. So as you are looking through your read aloud books that you're going to read each week, really try to pick out those tier 2 words, and they're going to be different based on the stories that you're reading. Now, like I said, using read alouds is probably the most common and obvious way to teach vocabulary to our students, and it is a great one for many different reasons. But there are some other ways that you can teach your students new vocabulary that don't involve a read aloud necessarily. I often like to choose some themed vocabulary based on what's happening in the world or in our community. Again, you still want it to be integrated with what your students are learning or what they are experiencing. So in my last video, I actually shared a holiday vocabulary freebie that I have for you, and I chose these specifically to teach around the holiday season. Students are going to have experiences with traditions, connection, the word jolly, thoughtful, lively. I picked all these words because they're going to come across in different texts that we read over the next couple weeks, along with the fact that they're also going to experience some of these things. So like I said, that's actually a free vocabulary mini unit that I have for you with those 5 word cards, along with a bunch of research-based activities to go along with those words. So I will link that down in the description in case you want to grab it. But yeah, instead of always choosing words from a read aloud, you can think about what's going on in your students' lives, community, around the world, and kind of pull those outside words into your classroom so your students have a better understanding of what's going on around them. All right, so now we know how many words we need to teach our students, where we can get those words, and now we want to know how can we effectively teach these words to our students. Well, many of you watching already know that I completed my letters training a few years ago, and I wanted to flip back to the vocabulary section as I was doing this video and kind of refresh, and I remembered that there is a 5-step process that they share for effective vocabulary instruction, so I wanted to share that with you. When we're introducing these new words to our students, here are the 5 steps we should go through. Number 1 is to say the word aloud, write it, and read it. When students are learning a new word, we want them to understand all facets of the word, including what the word looks like, how many syllables, how many sounds. So we want them to be able to say the word, we want them to see it written down, and we also want them to read it. Step 2 is to tell students what the new word means using a student-friendly definition, and also provide any visual supports that students may need. This is a good time to mention that dictionary definitions really aren't that helpful for your young students, and really even most students, because oftentimes those definitions are a little bit confusing, they're very wordy, and they don't really allow students to make any sort of connection to the word. So here we want to come up with our own student-friendly definition, and again, any image you can show or visual or something that students can kind of relate it to, even better for them. All right, step 3 is to say more about the word. Now, this might sound pretty vague, but we want to use the word several times in context. So we want to give our students some sentences that they might understand, or maybe have heard this word before, so they can understand what it means. And we also want to explicitly tell them what the word is not. This way they understand what the word is and what it isn't. All right, step 4 is to ask yes or no questions about the word's meaning that your students can answer. So now that you've explained to them what the word is and what it isn't, now you want to give them different examples of the word and ask, does this sound like this word? Yes, or does it not? No. And in that freebie that I provided for you about the holidays, I have specific yes or no cards that you can use with your students. So for example, I will have a little blurb and I will ask my students, does this sound like a tradition? And they'll say yes or no, and then they'll explain why. And last but not least, step 5 is to elicit word use by students. Once they have learned this word, again, we want them to own the word. We want them to be able to use it. There's this process of ownership that we go through with vocabulary words, where essentially we may have an unknown word where we've never heard of it, and then we have a word that maybe it is known, like I've heard of this before, I might know it in maybe a specific context, but I don't really know it super well. And then we have a word that we own, right? We really understand the different connections, the different meanings of this word. I can use it often and I can use it confidently, right? So we have unknown, known, and own. And these words we are explicitly teaching to our students, we want them to own them. So those are the 5 steps you should follow when you are introducing a new vocabulary word to your students. If you need to go back, rewind, and go ahead and kind of screenshot those 5 steps, that is totally fine. Go ahead and do that. Write it down. But it's important to note that that is just the introduction of the new word. That is how we can effectively introduce a new word and kind of talk about different facets of the word, but that's not where the instruction is going to end. We want our students to continue using these words throughout the week, throughout the month. Again, we want them to own it. So you might have a special area in your classroom, like wow words that you use for your students, where our students can kind of see them and be reminded to use them often. But also, going back to my other 2 videos that I shared, you are going to want to use activities like that to have your students practice these words. If it's a word with multiple meanings, you'll want to go in depth and talk about all the different meanings of this word. You might want to make a word web with your students where we think of the base word that we are learning and we make connections to it. And let's see how far our connections can go. You might want to take that word and make connections with other things your students are learning to help them expand their semantic network, right? So they're introduced to this word, they hear the word in context in a story that you're reading aloud, and then they do some vocabulary activities with this word. They connect the word to something happening in their own life or something that they've seen or heard of before. Again, all of this development of this word is going to help their students deeply understand what it means. So I know you are heading off into your holiday break, but I hope as the new year comes around, you'll be able to really think about these vocabulary ideas and activities and implement them in your own classroom next year. Even if you haven't been explicitly teaching 10 to 12 words this year, you can still do that starting in January. Now you'll know how to choose some great words for your students as well as how to teach them explicitly, and we can really help close the gap between the word rich and the word poor. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will go ahead and link that vocabulary freebie down in the description, and I will link those other 2 vocabulary videos in case you want to check those out as well. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a like so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click the bell. That way you're notified of all my new videos. See you in the new year. Bye.